Chapter 17. With one final truncated lightsaber sweep, the last of the chunks came away from the opening and crashed hollowly to the rocky floor. There, Luke said, peering into the hole. What do you think? Mara stepped close to his side and shined her glow rod into the opening. Still going to be tight for the droid, she said, but I think it'll do. Luke glanced back over his shoulder to the 8-quam jaw hanging from the passageway ceiling. Yes, it would do. More importantly, now that Splitter of Stones and Keeper of Promises had returned with the Quamjaw hunters, Eater of Fire Creepers had promised, they should get moving before they lost any prestige in their guide's eyes. Or, to put it another way, before they lost so much confidence in Master Walker of Sky that they decided to back out of this trip entirely. They hadn't said much about Builder with Vine's violent death, but they were definitely avoiding the area where their friend had died. And they weren't going out of their way to be nice to Child of Winds either. If he and Mara didn't get moving, they were likely to be more of the same trouble they'd already had too much of. I agree, he said, returning his lightsaber to his belt and stepping over to the shrunken collection of items that had been his pack before the fire creepers had gotten to it. Aside from the food bars in their metal case, the spare blaster power packs and glow rods, and some of the synth rope, there wasn't much left. The bedrolls, survival tent, med packs, even the detonator casings on the grenades had all been ravaged into useless shreds. I guess we just take whatever we can salvage of this stuff? That's what I'm doing, Mara said. She had one of her ration boxes open and was sorting out the bars between the various pockets in her jumpsuit. Soldier's first rule: concentrate on the food. Understood, Luke said, starting to fill his own pockets. R2 rolled unsteadily up to him on the uneven ground and with a beep of invitation slid open the hidden compartment in his dome. I'm putting what's left of the synth rope in R2, Luke called to Mara, stuffing the coil into the compartment. In case you need it. Fine, Mara said. I'm ready. Me too, Luke said, gazing into the darkness. You want to stay with the same marching order? You mean with you in front and me behind handling the luggage? Mara asked, nodding towards R2. Luke felt his face warming. I know what you meant, Mara said, giving him a wry smile. But you're the Jedi, and if there's anything in there with big teeth, you've got the best chance of toasting it before it draws blood. So, after you. Luke looked up at the waiting Quamjaw. Sure, he said, shifting his glow rod to his left hand and drawing his lightsaber. We're ready, Splitter of Stones. Follow me, the Quamjaw said, dropping off the ceiling and fluttering into the darkness. It was quickly evident that their route wasn't so much a passageway as it was a narrow V-shaped crack in the rock. Within the first 3 steps, Luke was forced to return his lightsaber to his belt and wedge his glow rod into his tunic to free up his hands to help pull himself along. Behind him, he could hear R2's continuous nervous twittering and the occasional muted thunk where Mara bumped him into one of the side walls. Every time that happened, he had to fight back the impulse to offer his help. If Mara needed him, she would ask. Probably. Fortunately, the crack was only no more than 3 meters long, with a yellowish wall blocking the far end. This is the way inside, Splitter of Stone said from a perch at a small gap that broached the yellow wall near the top. Beyond this wall is the high tower. I'd say we're here, Mara commented. That wall's definitely artificial. Agreed, Luke said, wedging himself into a more or less steady position in front of the wall and drawing his lightsaber. You and R2 keep back. The wall was quite thin and, more importantly, not made of cortosis ore. 3 quick slices of the green blade and they had their entrance. Luke dropped through the opening, lightsaber and Jedi senses at the ready. Beyond the wall was a dark, high-ceilinged room, incredibly dusty, that extended out beyond the range of his glow rod beam. Spaced along the walls at 2 different heights were elaborately tooled wall sconces that looked like they had once held torches or torch-like lights. Above the sconces, at perhaps a dozen other points around the room, other gaps showed where sections of the yellow wall had crumbled away from the ceiling. Aside from the sconces, there were no other decorations or furnishings. Doesn't look like Hajarna, Mara muttered from behind him, waving her own glow rod around. What? Luke asked. There's a ruined fortress on the planet Hajarna, she explained. Card sometimes uses it as a meeting place. Yes, he said something about that when I saw him on Sisjani, Luke said. He said if this fortress was like that one, it could probably shrug off any attack he could throw at it. Him or the New Republic in general, Mira said grimly. The Hijarna fortress was made of some incredibly hard black stone that could eat mass turbolaser fire for breakfast. She gestured with her glow rod. My first look at the high tower from outside the cave mouth reminded me of that one, but the wall material here isn't anything like it. R2 whistled, his sensor unit extended and rotating back and forth as if searching for something. That doesn't necessarily mean anything, Luke pointed out, squatting down in front of the droid and peering at the datapad they'd rigged up to serve as translator for his more complicated comments. They could have been built by two different groups of the same people. Maybe. What's he saying? He says that from the fastenings, he doesn't think the wall sconces were part of the original furnishings, Luke said. For whatever that's worth. He straightened up and pointed towards the unseen part of the room. He also says there's a very strong power source operating somewhere over there. Really, Mira said with interest, taking a step in that direction and shining her glow rod into the darkness. Let's go take a look. No, Keeper of Promises said sharply from above Luke. Hang on, Luke said to Mira, looking up. Keeper of Promises was perched on one of the wall sconces, his wings quivering with agitation. What's wrong? He asked. That way lies destruction, the Quamjaw said. Others have searched that direction. None have ever returned. He says there's danger that way, Luke translated for Mira. Specifics unknown. Except that it eats Quamjaw, I presume, Mira said. On the other hand, the only way out of here has to be that direction. No, there is another way, Splitter of Stone said from one of the other sconces. Come. He flew across to the wall to their left and settled into a perch in one of the other gaps beneath the ceiling. Here, he said. Here is the entrance to the hidden passage. Really, Luke said, feeling his eyes narrow. The Quamjaw hadn't said anything about a hidden passage before. And this hidden passage leads into the high tower? Come, Splitter of Stone said. You will see. Hidden passage, huh? Mira commented as they crossed the room, R2 rolling along behind them. I don't recall that being mentioned before. Me neither, Luke said. It could have just been an oversight. Or an awkward but conveniently forgotten fact, Mira said darkly. R2 twittered questioningly. Awkward because hidden passages usually also have hidden exits, Mira said to the droid over her shoulder. And unless the Quamjaw have found a way through those exits, they won't know any more about the layout of the high tower than we do. How about it, Splitter of Stones? Luke asked. Have you and your people been inside, or haven't you? We have traveled all through the hidden passage, was the somewhat sullen reply. There are places where we can see the threateners and hear what they are saying. Let me guess, Mira said. They've never actually been in the high tower, but they'll be able to find their way around once we get them in. Basically, Luke said heavily. Apparently, for all their talk, no one's actually been inside the place. Some of the Quam Quay have been inside, Child of Wind spoke up. I know of some who have done so. Luke frowned at him. They have? Who? When? Friends from other nestings have entered from above, Child of Winds explained. But they have always been quickly driven out, and have seen very little. Still, that's apparently more than the Quamjaw have done, Luke said, looking at Splitter of Stones again. The Quamjaw was maintaining a stiff silence, but Luke could tell he was not at all pleased with this revelation. Have you yourself been inside, Child of Winds? No, he said. Only friends from the nesting nearest here. What's the debate? Mira asked. Child of Winds says some of the younger Quam Quay of the region have poked around inside the upper areas of the high tower, Luke said. But how is it you're in contact with these others, Child of Winds? I thought Hunter of Winds said matters outside your nesting were of no concern to you. They are of no concern to adult Quam Quay, Child of Winds said. But all children may fly freely wherever they wish. Ah. So adult Quamquay were territorial, but their children mixed together across nesting boundaries however they wanted, and in the process played the role of informal ambassadors and information gatherers, possibly. Something to remember if and when the New Republic decided to make official contact with them. Beside him, Mara cleared her throat. Is any of this no doubt fascinating conversation helping us get inside the high tower? Not really, Luke agreed, pushing the glimpse into Quamquay's social structure aside for now. Stepping to the yellow wall beneath where Splitter of Stones was sitting, he ran an exploring hand across the surface. If there was a hidden door there, it was very well hidden. You think we should look for a release or open it the easy way? Mara's answer was the snap hiss of her lightsaber. Get out of the way, she said. You too, Quamjaw. Splitter of Stones fluttered hastily to one of the wall sconces. 3 quick slashes, and Mara had a man-sized opening cut in the wall. Lightsaber held ready, she jumped into the gap and ducked to her right. Luke was right behind her, ducking to the left. They were in a narrow passageway, no more than 1.5 meters across, which, like the room behind them, extended to the right beyond the range of their glow rods. In the other direction, the passageway ended in a wall only a few meters away, and leading up over their heads from that end was a set of stairs. Over here, Mara, Luke called quietly over his shoulder as he headed that direction. The stairs were narrow, and like the passageway itself, extended past the range of his glow rod beam. Overhead to the left, he could see just the hint of an angled and rising ceiling. Another flight of steps, he decided, probably connecting with this set at some unseen landing ahead. Rising vertically along the inside edge of the stairway were a series of thick cylinders that ran from below the level of the passageway up into the darkness above. That's our way up, all right, Mara said from his side. Uh-oh. What? Luke asked, frowning as he stretched out with the Force. There was no danger he could detect. The stairs, Mara said, her glow rod shining downward on the lowest steps. Now that looks like Hajarna building material. Luke frowned down at it. Any way to tell for sure? A couple of blaster bolts ought to do it, she said. But the noise would probably travel farther than we'd like. Anyway, at the moment it's irrelevant. We're not launching a full-scale assault on the place. Right. We're trying to sneak in, Luke agreed. Looks like we'll have to go single file. I think we're all used to that by now, Mara said, playing her glow rod up and down the steps. Reminds me of that secret passageway Palpatine had in the Imperial Palace. Reminds me of the service shaft in Illic on New Cov, Luke said, remembering that long walk he and Han had taken up those stairs to a landing area crawling with Imperials. You'd think just one of their secret stair builders would have the courtesy to install a turbolift, Mara said, shaking her head. Or at least a droid carrier. It would be nice, Luke agreed. Well, nothing for it but to start climbing. Let's go. With the narrow but relatively open area ahead and above them, Luke decided to let Splitter of Stones and his cadre of Quamjaw take the point, flying up and ahead of them. Luke went next, carrying the droid for a change, leaving Mara and Child of Winds to bring up the rear. Mara had groused a little about that, arguing that she wasn't tired and could handle the droid just fine. But Luke had declared the staircase safe enough for him to take droid duty and had ignored her complaints. Not that she'd complained too hard or too long. The droid had been getting heavier and heavier lately, and she was just as glad to be rid of the burden for a while. Any idea what these are? She asked Luke, running her fingertips across the first of the thick vertical cylinders as she passed it. From this position on the stairs, she could now see to the first landing, and a quick count showed there were 20 of the cylinders rising through the gap. They don't look like ventilation shafts. The droid warbled. R2 says they're power lines, Luke told her. Probably bringing energy to the high tower from that big power source he picked up. That's one blazing lot of capacity, Mara said, eyeing the cylinders uneasily. Are all 20 of them pulling power? The droid twittered again. Only 3 are active at the moment, Luke said, but the others are still functional. Running to weapons or shield generators, maybe? I was just wondering that myself. Mara felt her lip twitch. From near the mouth of the cave, you can see 3 towers rising from the fortress, 3 intact and 1 broken. Yes, I remember that from the record the Starry Ice brought back, Luke said, his voice and emotions tight. You suggested that the shot that took out that tower might have also gouged out some of the ravine you flew in through. Is Hajarna stone that tough? I don't know, Mara said grimly, but Hajarna stone plus 17 power lines worth of shield generators might do the trick. Luke whistled softly, shaking his head. You know, this place is starting to look more and more impregnable by the minute. I don't think I like that. I'm sure I don't like it, Mira retorted grimly. Especially in potentially unfriendly hands. It'd be worse than Mount Tantus. They reached the landing in the expected switchback and continued on up. For a while, Mara tried to keep track of the stair count, but somewhere in the mid 200s she gave up the exercise as useless. They had passed the fourth landing when she began to detect the alien presence. She kept at the sensation for the next few minutes until she was sure. Then, as they started the round of the fifth landing, she leaned over and caught Luke's eye. Luke, she murmured. Company. I know, he murmured back. I've been picking them up for a while now. We must be getting close to the inhabited parts of the high tower. The sensation seem at all familiar to you? Very, he assured her. They're the same species as the pilots who tried to shoot me down on my way in. I've never gotten that close to any of this particular group, Mara said, a sudden shiver running through her. But I've definitely felt this sense before. Luke seemed to brace himself. Thrawn? She nodded. Thrawn. For a long moment they stood there in silence. Well, you called it, Mara reminded him. You said that might be a group of his people in there. It's starting to look that way, Luke said, looking up and waving towards him. Splitter of stones? There was a rustling of wings, and the Quam-Jaw fluttered to a landing on one of the stairs ahead of Luke. You said there were places where you could see and hear into the high tower, Luke said. How close are we to the nearest of those? Splitter of Stones began to speak. Suddenly tired of this second-class status of hers, Mara reached over and took Luke's hand. Not too far away, she heard the Quam-Jaw's voice echo through Luke's mind. 2 and a portion more turns. A portion? Mara asked, frowning. The spot must be partway up one of the stairways, Luke said, glancing at the cylinders running alongside them. At least these power lines should help mask our life form readings if anyone's looking. That's convenient. It also means R2 won't be able to pick up much of anything either, Mara pointed out. Not so convenient. But that will surely not be a problem for you, Child of Wind spoke up. You have the Force. True, Luke agreed. Some of us more than others, of course, Mara added, suppressing a grimace. As he had on that trek across Wayland 10 years ago, Luke had been giving her more and more or less non-stop Jedi instruction during the trip through the caverns. But despite those efforts, she was apparently no closer to hearing this weird force-driven communication of the Quam-Jaw and Quam-Quay than she'd been when she first arrived on the planet. And it was starting to bug her. It was starting to really bug her. What did she have to do to break through this invisible barrier to full Jedi powers, anyway? She didn't have an answer. Luke might, but she didn't, and there was no way in the galaxy she was going to ask him. Not any time soon, anyway. Disgustedly, she let go of his hand. Well, come on, she growled. If we're going to do this, let's do it. Right, Luke said. If he'd picked up on her sudden sour mood, he didn't comment on it. Okay, Splitter of Stones, let's go, and warn your people to be especially quiet from this point on. They resumed their climb. Mara followed along behind Luke, putting one foot in front of the other strictly on autopilot, her full attention turned outward as she stretched out to the alien presences growing steadily closer. None seemed to be very close, but from past experience she knew that with unfamiliar alien minds apparent distances could be misleading. 2 and a third flights of stairs later, as promised, they reached Splitter of Stone's observation post. That's an exit, all right, Mara muttered, peering into the alcove that opened off to the side of the stairway. Roughly 3 meters wide and 1 deep, it ended in a door-shaped panel made of black stone equipped with a locking wheel and a pair of hand-grip releases. In the center of the panel was a tiny hole through which an equally tiny ray of reddish light shone through. Looks like it swings upward. Yes, Luke murmured back, stepping into the alcove for a closer look. Interesting, this locking wheel. Why lock it from this side? Maybe it was for the exclusive use of certain high ranking parties who wanted everyone else kept out, Mara said, stretching out with the force. The alien presence was still pervasive, but still muted. If you want to give it a try, this is probably as good a time as any. Right. For a moment, Luke held his face against the door, peering through the peephole. Then, gripping the wheel, he turned it to the left. Mara winced in anticipation, but the screech of rusted metal she'd expected didn't happen. In fact, the muted sound struck her more like pieces of polished stone sliding smoothly against each other. Luke finished turning the wheel, then took hold of the two grip releases. Here we go, he muttered, and squeezed. Whoever had designed the self-lubrication for the locking wheel had apparently also designed the hinges. Again, with only the faint rumble of stone against stone, the door swung open. Mira was through the opening before the door had finished its swing, blaster in hand, her senses stretched fully alert. They were at the end of a fairly wide corridor, she saw, that stretched for perhaps 20 meters before opening into an open atrium-like area with a wide central pillar running vertically through it, from which pale reddish light was streaming. Spaced along each side of the corridor were 5 recessed doors, each flanked by 2 of the wall sconces that they'd seen in the underground room below. Unlike those, though, the upper sections of these sconces were glowing with a muted white light, the illumination adding to the dimmer red coming from the pillar in the atrium. The corridor's floor and ceiling were covered in an intricate pattern of tiny interlocked tiles, while the walls were a contrasting plain silvery metal. From the entryway behind her came a soft twitter. R2 says the red light is the same spectrum as the sun, Luke said from her side. Either we're near the top or they're piping the light down here. I'd guess the latter, Mara said. The decor's a surprise. The Hijarna fortress is nothing but plain black stone. Feel like a little reconnoiter? Sure, Luke said. Splitter of stones. If you or the others know anything about the high tower you haven't told us, this is the time to do it. There were more of the Quamjaw chirps and almost speech, and abruptly all 8 of them flapped past Mara and headed down the corridor. Reaching the end, they split up and vanished off in different directions. He said they don't know anything more, Luke told Mara, but that they're eager to learn. As long as they don't bring the locals down on us, Mara said, flicking off her glow rod and sliding it away into a pocket. You'd probably better leave the droid here. I was planning to, Luke said. R2, get back in the alcove out of sight and close the door. Child of Winds? No, you stay here with R2. There was an obvious complaint from the young Quamquay. Not now, Luke said firmly. Later, maybe, but not now. Come on, Mara. They headed out along the corridor, Child of Winds still fussing behind them. Looks like a residential area, Luke commented, nodding towards the doors they were passing. Yes, Mara said, frowning at the central pillar they were approaching. As they neared it, she could see that it was shaped like a giant circular stairway, except with a smooth ramp instead of a staircase spiraling around it. And the edge. Is that ramp moving? It does look like it, Luke said, craning his neck. Like a spiral slideway going up. They reached the end of the corridor, and Mara eased an eye around the corner. More corridors like the one they were in were visible, spreading out like sunburst rays centered around an open area around the spiral slideway. Definitely a barracks section, she said. I wonder where the down ramp is. It's on the inside half of the up ramp, Luke said, pointing. See? That intersection is going down. I see it, Mara nodded. Must be tricky getting across the up ramp when you want to get off. We'll probably get a chance to try it, Luke said, stepping close to Mara and putting his arm around her shoulder. She frowned at him, opened her mouth to ask what he was doing. No one, Keeper of Promise's voice came as the Quamjaw fluttered into sight from one of the other corridors. Some of the other passages end in walls, but most continue on into other such caverns. Did you see anyone? Mara asked. We saw no one, Keeper of Promises said, in the slightly miffed tone of someone who's been asked a question he's already answered. Thank you. Luke tilted his head to look at Mara. What do you want? Up or down? Up, Mara said, easing away from him. It was always a little disconcerting to look at someone whose face was barely 15 centimeters away. All the command rooms and other interesting stuff at Tajarna were on the upper floors. Up it is, Luke said, releasing his grip on her and crossing to the spiral slideway. Looks clear, he added, looking cautiously up into the opening as Mara joined him. You picking up any danger? No more than I have been for the past 10 minutes, Mara said. Sure, let's try it. Right. Luke waved at Keeper of Promises. Come on, Quamjaw, we're heading up. They stepped onto the outer section of the slideway, both of them stumbling slightly as their bodies were forced to catch up with suddenly moving feet. It definitely feels like we're getting closer to the aliens, Luke commented as the group of Quamjaw flapped past on their way to the next level. I just wish I had a better benchmark for their species. Yes, it'd be nice to know how close they actually were, Mara agreed, watching above them as the Quamjaw split up again and headed off in all directions. One of the reinforcements, Flyer through spikes, Mara tentatively identified him, reappeared overhead as she and Luke reached the level, jabbering away. He says they found no one up here either, Luke repeated. Splitter of stones has suggested. The flare of her danger sense was Mara's only warning. Luke! Down! Luke snapped, igniting his lightsaber. Mara was already dropping to one knee, spinning around as her eyes and blaster searched for a target. A movement just inside one of the corridors caught her eye. She tracked her blaster towards it, and abruptly the world exploded into a flash of brilliant blue. Instinctively, she ducked away from the bolt, her blaster spitting return fire. Another blue flash changed to green as Luke's lightsaber slashed across it, deflecting the bolt across the room. There was another blue flash, again caught by the lightsaber blade. Mara fired twice, had the satisfaction of seeing the half-hidden gunman duck back. Behind you! Luke barked. Mara dropped from her kneeling crouch to land flat on her stomach on the ramp, twisting around to face the other direction as she did so. Two burgundy-uniformed gunmen were visible back there, sprinting from the end of one of the corridors towards the protection of something that looked like a small service vehicle. She fired 2 shots, missed with both, and abruptly one of the gunmen stopped dead in his tracks, raising his weapon towards her in a two-handed grip. Mara tracked her blaster towards him, a small part of her mind noting the blue skin of his face and hands, and the glowing red eyes glaring out at her. Watch out! But the warning came too late. Even as Mara fired again and then twisted around to search out the new threat, there was another flash of blue, and a lance of agony jabbed into her right shoulder. She might have gasped in pain. She wouldn't remember later whether she had or not. But suddenly Luke was crouching on the slideway beside her, his surge of fear dimly sensed through the waves of pain hammering at her. His hand briefly probed the area of the wound, and she could feel the pain ease somewhat as the force flowed from him into her. What do you think? She managed through clenched teeth. We seen enough for this pass? Sounds good to me, he said, his lightsaber humming angrily as he swatted more of the blue blasts. Then... She blinked in surprise. Above her was the edge of one of the fortress floors, but it was pulling up and away from her. Even now she could see they were coming down to the level they'd started from. How'd we get to the down part of the slideway? She asked. You rolled onto it when you were hit, he told her, shifting his hand from her neck to a supporting grip cradling her shoulders. Don't you remember? She shook her head. The movement sent a fresh surge of agony through her shoulder. Combat reflex, I guess. Wait! My blaster! It's all right. Keeper of Promises picked it up, Luke assured her, shutting down his lightsaber. He half rose from his crouch, and she could feel herself also rising in the eerily intangible grip of the Force. Here we go. The level they'd come in on was starting to move past them now. Stretching out to the Force, carrying Mara with him, Luke leaped over the up section of the slideway to land on the solid floor beyond. Cradling her in both arms, he hurried down the corridor towards their hidden door. Look, I can walk on my own, Mara growled, glancing back over Luke's shoulder as he ran. Some of the Quamjaw were visible coming up behind them, but so far there was no sign of other pursuit. You don't have to carry me. Don't argue, Luke bit out, his mind frothing with concern and worry. I just hope R2 didn't lock the door. Ah. Ahead, the door was swinging ponderously open towards them, pushed by an obviously straining Child of Winds. Trying to work past her pain, Mara stretched out to the door with the force, giving him as much assistance as she could manage. The droid, rolling forward to help, squawked in surprise and hastily backed up just in time as Luke and Mara charged in, followed by four of the Quam Jaw. "Seal the door!" Mara heard Splitter of Stone's order through Luke's mind as the Quam Jaw flapped madly to a halt. "What about the others?" Luke asked as two of the Quam Jaw landed on the hand grips and began tugging. "They have gone into the other passages," Splitter of Stone said. "They will try to lead the threateners away from this area." "We can hope," Luke said as the door swung back into place. "Seal the door. I'm going to take Mara down to that last landing." "No, go up," Mara said, digging out her glow rod with her left hand as Luke started down the stairs. "If they find the door, they'll probably assume we went down." "Makes sense," Luke agreed, turning and heading up. "R2, you make sure they get it sealed and then stand guard." A minute later, they'd reached the landing. "I wish we still had our bedrolls," Luke said as he laid her carefully down on the cold stone and took the glow rod from her. "How does it feel?" "Like someone's roasting an Ewok in there," Mara told him. "Not as bad as it was, though. Is that a pain suppression trick you're using on me?" "For what it's worth," Luke said, sticking the glow rod between his teeth and stripping off his jacket. "It's not nearly as effective on someone else as it is on yourself," he added, talking around the glow rod as he bunched the jacket and slid it under her head as a pillow. "I knew there was something else I should have stuck around the academy long enough to learn," she said, hissing between her teeth as Luke set the glow rod down on her chest and began carefully pulling the burned edges of the cloth away from the wound. "I don't suppose you offer a crash course?" "I usually like to ease into that lesson a little more gradually." Luke's lip twitched. "Ouch." Mara looked down at her shoulder and immediately wished she hadn't. "Ouch doesn't even begin to cover it," she told him, feeling a little sick as she resolutely turned her eyes away. The burn was a lot nastier than she'd guessed. "I think I've just decided I'm going to miss the med pack more than I am the bedrolls." "Don't give up just yet," Luke soothed. His fingers were stroking the skin of her shoulder and neck, and as they did so, the pain again decreased. "I know a couple more tricks." "That feels good," Mara said, closing her eyes. "I'm putting you into a healing trance," Luke explained, his voice sounding oddly distant. "It can be a little slow, but sometimes it's as effective as a Bacta tank." "I hope this is one of those times," Mara murmured. Suddenly she was feeling very tired. "Yet another wonderful Jedi trick you'll have to teach me sometime." "Night, Luke. Don't forget to wake me if the bad guys crash the party." "Good night, Mara," Luke said softly. Softly and uselessly. She was already sound asleep. "Is she going to die?" an anxious voice asked from beside him. Engrossed in Mara's injury and the setting up of the healing trance, he hadn't noticed Child of Wind's arrival. Some master Jedi. "No, she'll be all right," he said. "The wound isn't dangerous, and I have some healing abilities." Child of Wind sidled a little closer, peering with unblinking eyes at the woman stretched out at Luke's side. "Was it my fault, Jedi Skywalker?" he asked at last. "Did I not open the door quickly enough?" "No, not at all," Luke assured him. "It had absolutely nothing to do with you." "Then it was the Quam Jah who failed you." Luke frowned at the Quam Quay. Given the annoyingly persistent rivalry between the two groups, he would have expected a note of condemnation, or at least lofty superiority, in Child of Wind's judgment. But there was nothing there but regret and sadness. "Perhaps," Luke said, "but it may not really be their fault either. The threateners may have detected our arrival and put together an ambush. And don't forget that cave dwellers like the Quam Jaw probably don't see as well in lighted rooms as you or I would." Child of Wind seemed to consider that. "If the threateners laid a snare, they may enter this place to search for you." "They might," Luke agreed. "If they even know about it, of course. They might not. All the dust in here would indicate that it hasn't been used for quite a while." "Still, they may know even if they do not use it," Child of Winds reminded him. "Your friend machine and the Quam Jaw watch and wait below. Should not someone also watch and wait above?" "That's a good idea," Luke agreed. Go tell Splitter of Stones I want him to send 2 of his hunters to stand watch at the next stairway exit above us." "I will obey," the Quamquay said, stretching out his wings. "But he will need send only 1 hunter. I will go myself to watch with him." Luke opened his mouth to object, closed it again. Child of Winds had been chafing under the casual contempt of the Quam jaw ever since they'd reached the cave. This was something useful he could do that probably wouldn't be too dangerous. "All right, Child of Winds. Thank you." "There are no thanks needed," Child of Winds said. "It is only what is right for me to do for the Jedi Skywalker." He cocked his head for one final look at Mara. "And for his beloved companion." Spreading his wings, he flapped away into the darkness of the stairway, leaving that last comment echoing uncomfortably in Luke's mind. Beloved companion. Companion. Beloved. He looked down at Mara, her familiar features thrown into starkly contrasting areas of light and shadow by the beam of the glow rod. Beloved. No, he murmured to himself. No, he liked Mara, certainly. Liked her very much. She was smart and resourceful, with a mental and emotional toughness he could rely on, plus a sharp humor and irreverence that made for a refreshing contrast with the automatic and unthinking awe too many people held him in these days. She'd been a trusted ally through some very hard and dangerous times, sticking with him and Han and Leia even when the rest of a hostile New Republic hierarchy had declared her untrustworthy. And perhaps most important of all, she was strong and capable in the Force, with the ability to share his thoughts and emotions in a way that even a couple as close as Han and Leia couldn't experience. But he wouldn't love her. He couldn't take that risk. Every time in the past that he had allowed himself the luxury of caring that deeply about a woman, something terrible had happened to her. Gariel had been killed. Callista had lost her Jedi abilities and finally left him. The list of tragedies sometimes seemed endless. Still, if Mira's theory was right, all of those disasters had happened while he was still under the lingering effects of his brush with the dark side. Would things be different now? Could they be different? He shook his head firmly. No. He could try all the logic in the world, could come up with reason after reason why he could perhaps allow himself to have feelings like that again. But not now. Not with Mara. Because hanging like a dark specter over all of this was the memory of that vision he'd had barely a month ago on Tirfin. The vision where he'd seen Han and Leia in danger from a mob, where he'd seen Wedge and Corran and Rogue Squadron in the heat of battle, where he'd seen himself on the Sisjani balcony, from which he would later be taken to Talon Card and learn of Mara's disappearance, and where he'd seen Mara surrounded by craggy rock and floating motionlessly in a pool of water. Her eyes closed, her arms and legs limp, as if in death. He gazed down at her again, a quiet ache in his heart. Perhaps that was her destiny, an end to her life that he could do nothing to prevent. But until that was proved, he would tear his own life apart if necessary to prevent it from happening. And a part of that sacrifice was to keep her out of the shadow of destructive dark side influence he had on so many others. Then that was a sacrifice he would have to make. But for now, what she needed most was to be healed, and that would take no sacrifice, merely time and attention. "Good night," he said again, knowing she couldn't hear him. On impulse, he leaned over and kissed her gently on the lips. Then, stretching out on the cold stone next to her, he rested his head beside hers on a corner of his folded jacket and laid his arm across her chest where his fingertips could touch the area around her burned shoulder. Easing himself into a sort of half-trance to aid in concentration, he stretched out to the Force and set to work. And that's the end of the chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.